Have you ever wondered why the most devastating form of revenge needs no words, no grand gestures, and no confrontation at all? A woman, fully embodied in her feminine essence, can destroy illusions more ruthlessly than fire, by withdrawing her energy in silence. Men have built empires to conquer lands, but countless have been undone by the quiet withdrawal of a woman who once gave her warmth freely. This is not the cold, petty silence of passive aggression. This is the silence of the archetypal feminine, the silence that echoes with centuries of intuition, pain, and power reclaimed. It is a silence that reflects him back to himself like a mirror he cannot shatter, no matter how much he tries to look away. Carl Jung would call this the awakening of the anima within the male psyche, the feminine archetype every man carries but fears to face. For when a woman ceases to beg, to explain, to convince, she awakens the void inside him. He is left not only without her presence, but also without his own illusion of dominance. In silence, she does not punish him. She simply stops feeding the projection that once sustained his fragile ego. The silence is not absence, it is revelation. He is forced to hear the chaos of his own unintegrated shadow because she no longer cushions it with her softness. And you, yes, you who may have felt this before, know the sensation of being erased, not with cruelty, but with detachment. A man can handle a scream, for anger still acknowledges him, but the absence of sound, the absence of needing him, is unbearable. It is the unspoken revenge only feminine energy can deliver. The refusal to participate in his narrative any longer. Silence is the cutting off of oxygen to the fire of his ego. And like a flame gasping for air, he flickers, sputters, and faces himself in the smoke. This power is not something women create. It is something they remember. Throughout history, the feminine has been told to appease, to comfort, to endlessly forgive. Yet when a woman sees the futility of pouring life into a vessel that leaks, she turns her gaze inward. The silence is not vindictive. It is sacred self-preservation. It says, "My essence is too rare to be wasted. My spirit is not an echo of your needs. I return home to myself." And in that act, her silence roars louder than any accusation. Jung warned that what a man refuses to integrate will inevitably rule him from the shadows. The neglected anima becomes a tormenting ghost, haunting his relationships and distorting his vision. When the real woman before him falls into silence, he is left with nothing but his own disowned feminine, his tenderness, his vulnerability, his need for love, now unbearable because he never learned to hold it. The absence of her voice forces him to hear his own. But make no mistake, this is not silence as weakness. This is silence as discipline, silence as stoic power. Seneca once wrote, "He who has injured thee was either stronger or weaker. If weaker, spare him. If stronger, spare thyself." The feminine, in silence, spares herself. She no longer spends her life trying to reform what does not wish to grow. She simply ceases to offer her energy to what drains her. Like a river withdrawing from a thirsty land, her retreat forces recognition. Without her, he must face his own barrenness. And for the woman who chooses silence, the transformation is profound. In stepping back, she moves beyond reaction into sovereignty. She is no longer defined by the pain he caused, nor by the validation he withheld. She enters the archetype of the high priestess, the keeper of mystery, who knows her value cannot be bargained. Her silence is not emptiness, it is full of meaning, a womb of rebirth where she gathers her energy for something greater than his approval. You may feel the sting of betrayal, the ache of abandonment, the rage of injustice. Yet in silence, those flames can be alchemized into clarity. You discover that the most potent revenge is not destruction, but elevation. When he no longer occupies your tongue or your thoughts, when your silence is not forced but chosen, You transcend the role of victim and step into the role of sovereign. He is left wondering, reaching, haunted by the absence of what once defined him. But you are already elsewhere, already building a kingdom within, already tasting the peace of detachment. And so the silent revenge of the feminine is not about hurting him. It is about ending the illusion that he ever had the power to define her. Silence does not seek retribution. It declares completion. The story is over. The energy withdrawn. The lesson returned to him like a mirror he cannot escape. There is a moment, often unnoticed at first, when silence begins to reshape everything. At the surface, it looks like nothing. No raised voice, no final letter, no dramatic declaration. Yet beneath, an earthquake is taking place. The man senses it like an animal before a storm. The warmth that once enveloped him has cooled. The attention that once inflated his ego is gone. He does not hear the words, but he feels the absence in his bones. And this absence is more excruciating than any presence could ever be. For the feminine, this silence carries the weight of generations. It is not only her voice withheld, it is the voice of countless women before her, silenced by duty, by fear, by survival. To choose silence now, consciously, is to reclaim what was once stolen. This silence is not submission. It is sovereignty. It is the recognition that her energy is currency, and she will no longer invest in a bankrupt soul. She is no longer reacting to his projections. She is no longer trapped in his web of control. She stands still, and in her stillness, she becomes untouchable. Psychologically, silence functions as a mirror. Carl Jung taught that projections collapse when they are no longer met with reinforcement. A man who projected his unmet needs onto a woman, expecting her to soothe his insecurity, to validate his worth, to endlessly supply what he lacks, suddenly finds his projection returned to him. She has stopped carrying his disowned pieces, and so he must carry them himself. What he sees in the silence is not her rejection, but his own emptiness. This is why silence is the cruelest form of revelation. It does not tell him who he is. It forces him to see it for himself. You can imagine the panic this awakens. He may reach out, test boundaries, provoke, accuse, anything to stir a response. But every unanswered call, every unanswered message, every moment of stillness reinforces the truth. She no longer plays his game. The ego, desperate to remain in control, despises silence. For silence cannot be argued with. It cannot be persuaded or manipulated. It is not a duel. It is withdrawal. And nothing terrifies the ego more than irrelevance. Marcus Aurelius once wrote, "The best revenge is not to be like your enemy." In the feminine silence, this principle breathes. She does not match his cruelty with cruelty, his betrayal with vengeance, his chaos with noise. She chooses stillness. She chooses not to be dragged into his shadow. She refuses to mirror his lack of control. And in doing so, she becomes something larger than his reach. He expected her to rage, to plead, to demand closure, because such responses still orbit around him. But when she chooses silence, she no longer orbits. She becomes her own center of gravity. This transformation is deeply alchemical. Silence turns pain into clarity, grief into dignity, abandonment into freedom. The woman who enters silence discovers she does not need his recognition to validate her existence. She learns that the greatest intimacy is not found in clinging to what hurts, but in standing fully with herself. Silence reveals who she is without him, not the role she played in his life, not the reflection of his projections, but the sovereign self who does not need to explain or justify her worth. Yet the silence is not easy. It is a discipline forged in fire. To resist the urge to speak, to explain, to demand understanding requires immense strength. The human heart craves to be heard. The ego craves to be acknowledged. But in silence, she renounces those cravings. She learns that validation is a chain, that explanation is often a disguised plea for approval. True power lies not in being understood, but in no longer needing to be. And so, silence becomes a practice of detachment. It is not passive, it is active mastery. Each unspoken word is an act of self-respect. Each unanswered provocation is a reminder that her peace is worth more than his chaos. She begins to notice the quiet beauty of her own company, the spaciousness that opens when his noise no longer fills the room. And in that spaciousness, her feminine essence breathes again, wild, intuitive, radiant. No longer contorted to fit his needs, she expands into her own. For him, this silence is unbearable. For her, it is liberation. He may frame it as punishment, as cruelty, as indifference, but she knows the truth. Silence is not about him at all. It is about reclaiming herself. The silent revenge is not the destruction of his world. It is the creation of hers. And as she builds it, stone by stone, he is left outside the gates, haunted not by what she said, but by what she no longer says. Silence, when embodied with intention, transforms from absence into presence. It does not fade into emptiness. It expands, filling the air with a gravity more powerful than any words could achieve. A man feels it not in his ears, but in his chest, in the hollow spaces where her attention once lived. The silence carries weight, like a cathedral stripped of sound, where every whisper of the soul becomes unbearable to avoid. He once dismissed her voice as too much, too emotional, too demanding. Now, stripped of it, he confronts the terrifying truth. He was dependent on the very presence he claimed to undervalue. This is the paradox of feminine energy. While expressed, it nourishes, softens, and inspires. But when withdrawn, it reveals the depth of his reliance. She was the mirror in which he saw his imagined greatness, the soil in which his fragile masculinity took root. Her silence yanks away the reflection, and suddenly he is left staring into the raw mirror of his own inadequacy. Carl Jung warned that when the anima is denied, when the feminine within is repressed, it returns as torment. What he experiences in her silence is not her cruelty, but his own neglected soul pressing against the walls of his psyche. And yet the silence does more than expose him. It reshapes her. Within the quiet, she begins to hear herself again. Where once his voice drowned hers out, where once she twisted herself into knots to appease, now she feels the rhythm of her own being. Silence becomes a sanctuary. It is not loneliness, but sacred solitude. She begins to recognize that what she mistook for love was often labor, endless emotional labor to patch holes in a vessel that refused to hold water. In silence, she sets down the burden, and the freedom is intoxicating. Do you see it? This is not about punishing him. This is about awakening her. The feminine silence is a reclamation of space, a refusal to barter her worth for scraps of recognition. It is an initiation into sovereignty. You may feel it too, the deep pull toward explaining yourself, toward defending your decision to step back. But every explanation keeps you tethered to his perception. Every defense binds you again to his judgment. True liberation is found not in persuading him to understand, but in no longer requiring that he does. This discipline mirrors the Stoics, who taught that control lies only in the self. Epictetus declared, "It's not what happens to you, but how you react to it that matters." The feminine silence embodies this truth. She cannot control his actions, his betrayals, his projections, but she can control her energy, her words, her presence. By choosing not to react, she chooses not to be controlled. Her silence becomes the ultimate assertion. I will not let you dictate who I am or how I feel. Psychologically, silence dismantles the cycle of projection. He may rage against it, insisting she explain, insisting she justify, insisting she participate in the drama. But each non-response breaks the pattern. Without fuel, the projection starves. What remains is his raw shadow, unbuffered, staring back at him. He may spiral, lash out, or retreat, but all of it is his. No longer carried by her, no longer balanced against her reactions, it belongs solely to him. And that is a burden he cannot bear without transformation. Meanwhile, she rises. In the archetypal language of Jung, she shifts from the wounded maiden to the wise woman, from the reactive lover to the sovereign queen. Her silence is not passivity, it is metamorphosis. Like a chrysalis, still and unmoving, yet within, the caterpillar dissolves and reforms into the butterfly. Outwardly, nothing seems to happen. Inwardly, everything is being reborn. She no longer chases resolution from him, for she realizes the true resolution is within herself. The most haunting part for him is this: silence carries no closure. Words give finality. Explanations can be argued. Accusations can be deflected. But silence leaves an open wound that he cannot stitch. He must live with the echo, the unanswered questions, the unresolved story. It lingers like a ghost, haunting him not because of her cruelty, but because of his own failure to see her when she was present. That is the torment of the anima denied. Once she is gone, the absence consumes him. And for her, the torment ends. Silence frees her from the endless cycle of proving, defending, and waiting. It unchains her from the illusion that her worth depends on his recognition. She steps out of the battlefield, not in defeat, but in triumph, because the battle was never hers to fight. In silence, she remembers the truth that was always waiting. Her essence is whole, with or without his gaze. There is a sacred violence in silence, the kind that does not slash with steel but cuts with absence, dismantling illusions one breath at a time. It is violence not in cruelty, but in clarity. For a man intoxicated by the belief that her energy would always be there, the sudden stillness is shattering. What once seemed ordinary, the way her eyes softened when he entered the room, the way her words cushioned his insecurities, suddenly reveals itself as extraordinary in its disappearance. He realizes, perhaps too late, that her presence was not guaranteed, but a gift. And now that gift has been withdrawn. The power of this silence lies in its refusal to engage. Arguments entangle. Explanations prolong. Even anger binds two souls together in opposition. But silence severs. It creates an abyss he cannot cross with manipulation or charm. It leaves him alone with himself, and there is no enemy more fearsome than one's own unexamined shadow. Jung warned that, until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life, and you will call it fate. Her silence is the catalyst of this confrontation. It removes the distraction of her voice, forcing him to hear the whisper of his own. Yet while he wrestles with his ghosts, her journey is one of ascent. In silence, she rises beyond the drama, beyond the dance of victim and perpetrator, beyond the exhausting cycle of emotional servitude. She steps into the archetype of the sovereign feminine, who does not chase, does not beg, does not demand. She simply is. And in her being, she radiates a strength that needs no witness. For the woman who has mastered silence does not wait for recognition. She embodies it. This is not an easy mastery. The temptation to speak, to cry out, to reclaim justice with words is powerful. Every nerve in the body aches for release. But silence teaches endurance. It is a discipline of spirit, a sharpening of will. Like the Stoics standing firm against fortune's blows, she learns that true power is measured not by what she says, but by what she refuses to say. Her silence becomes her fortress, a citadel where his arrows cannot reach. In this stillness, she begins to sense a truth deeper than vengeance. She does not need to win against him. She only needs to reclaim herself. Have you noticed how silence changes the air? At first, it feels empty, uncomfortable, unbearable. But stay with it long enough, and it reveals itself as fullness, a field where intuition blooms, where forgotten parts of the self reawaken. In her silence, she begins to hear the voice she silenced for him, her own. The voice that says she is enough, that her softness is not weakness, that her love is not a debt to be exploited. What once was drowned out by the noise of his needs now emerges with clarity. She is not diminished by his absence. She is magnified by her own presence. And he? He is forced to grapple with what he has lost. Silence becomes his teacher, though he resents its lessons. He remembers her laughter, her warmth, the way her energy filled the spaces of his emptiness. He may try to recreate it elsewhere, to seek it in another, but nothing compares to the silence she left behind. For her silence was not simply withdrawal, it was a mirror, a truth-telling void that revealed his dependence, his immaturity, his failure to integrate the feminine within. What he misses is not only her, it is the wholeness she awakened in him, the wholeness he must now seek alone. This is why silence is the most devastating revenge. Not because it harms him, but because it shows him himself. And few men are ready to face the unfiltered truth of who they are without the scaffolding of a woman's devotion. His power seemed solid, but her silence exposes it as fragile, built on the invisible labor of her energy. Without it, he crumbles. And she, in her stillness, learns that she was never powerless, only persuaded to forget. Silence is not the end. It is the threshold. Beyond it lies a new kind of feminine power, not reactive, not pleading, not desperate, but sovereign. It is the power of detachment, of no longer measuring worth by his attention. It is the power of saying nothing, not out of fear, but out of freedom. She chooses silence not because she has nothing to say, but because what she has to say no longer requires his ears to be true. In this way, silence ceases to be revenge at all. It becomes liberation. The ultimate justice is not that he suffers. It is that she is free. Free to walk in her essence unchained. Free to nurture her spirit without compromise. Free to love again not from need, but from abundance. For the woman who has walked through silence and emerged whole is untouchable. She no longer seeks validation outside herself because she has found it within. Silence matures into something far greater than withdrawal. It becomes a language of its own, a language that does not speak in words but in presence, dignity, and detachment. Over time, the man who once believed her devotion was endless begins to understand that he was not simply ignored, he was erased from her inner world. Silence is not a pause, not a waiting. It is finality dressed in serenity. It is the invisible door closing with no sound, no warning, no appeal. And behind that door, she is already gone. For the woman, silence is a womb of rebirth. It gathers all the fragments of herself that she once scattered into his hands. Her laughter bent to please him, her patience stretched to soothe him, her body offered to keep his affection, her voice dulled to spare his pride. In silence, she calls them back. Piece by piece, she reassembles the mosaic of her being. This act is not vengeful but holy. She realizes her worth was never diminished by his blindness. It was hidden beneath the noise of her own giving. By withdrawing, she uncovers it again. Psychologically, this is individuation in its purest form. Jung spoke of the journey toward the self, the integration of shadow, the balancing of the anima and animus, the wholeness of being that comes when we stop living as fragments of others' expectations. Her silence is the soil in which individuation takes root. She is no longer entangled in the projections cast upon her. She ceases to carry his unlived potential, his unacknowledged wounds, his fractured ego. In silence, she disentangles. She becomes whole unto herself, and he, left outside of this sacred retreat, encounters the bitter medicine of consequence. For while she rises, he descends into longing, into regret, into confrontation with the emptiness her absence unmasks. At first, he may rage against her silence, calling it cruelty, arrogance, even manipulation. But eventually, the truth pierces through. It is not her silence that tortures him, but his own disconnection from the feminine within. Her withdrawal simply reveals it. The silence she embodies echoes the silence within himself, the unacknowledged anima, the unloved inner child, the ignored need for tenderness. He is not punished by her. He is punished by his own neglect. And here lies the paradox. What feels like revenge to him is redemption for her. He sees punishment. She feels release. He sees rejection. She tastes resurrection. This is why the silent revenge of the feminine is so devastating. It does not aim to destroy, yet it dismantles completely. For a man centered only in ego, her silence threatens his entire structure of self. For a woman anchored in essence, her silence becomes the ground upon which she builds anew. Have you ever noticed that silence makes people reveal themselves? In noise, masks can survive. Words can disguise, arguments can distract, explanations can seduce. But in silence, the mask slips. His true nature, once concealed by her responses, comes into full view. Does he collapse into despair? Does he lash out in fury? Does he retreat into avoidance? Or does he, against all odds, turn inward and begin the painful work of facing himself? Silence does not dictate his path, but it exposes it. And exposure is its own form of judgment. For her, silence sharpens clarity. What once felt like confusion, does he love me? Does he value me? Will he change? Dissolves in the stillness. She no longer needs answers, because she has already chosen. Silence says more than any verdict. I will not negotiate my worth. I will not plead for recognition. I choose me. And in that choice, she transcends the battle entirely. No longer the prisoner of his attention, she becomes the master of her own. The Stoics would nod in recognition at this discipline. Marcus Aurelius wrote, "You have power over your mind, not outside events. Realize this, and you will find strength." Silence is her embodiment of this truth. She cannot command his heart, his choices, his growth. But she commands her energy, her presence, her voice. She chooses not to waste them in futile struggle. She chooses sovereignty over noise. And in that sovereignty, she finds unshakable power. In the end, the silent revenge of the feminine is not about him at all. It is about her becoming. It is about her realizing that the greatest strength is not in confrontation, but in detachment, not in winning him back, but in no longer needing him at all. He may never understand the silence. He may spend years haunted by it, searching for closure that will never come. But she has already stepped into a new life, carrying within her the peace that comes from no longer being bound. And this is the ultimate revelation. Silence is not the weapon. It is the healing. The revenge is only the shadow he feels. For her, silence is the dawn of a life where her essence is sovereign, her worth undeniable, her spirit free. The woman who knows her worth doesn't chase. She chooses.